Welcome to a Christian Union Forum this week. This is our first forum of the semester, and Christian Union is basically a club for people who are interested in Jesus. And forums is a way that we can discuss lots of issues surrounding Christian faith and apologetics and how we should live as Christians and so on. So, yeah, I hope you really enjoy it and find it really interesting. I'm going to hand over to Janice. You can introduce yourself. But to say a little bit out, Janice is a doctor, so she's done a PhD in medical ethics, and she's also done a medical doctorate, and she's had lots of experience in teaching ethics and medical ethics especially. So give her a warm welcome.
This year I haven't been asked to speak about anything except assisted dying. And you know why that is, don't you? Because in Victoria last year, November, legislation was introduced in the Victorian Parliament and passed to allow assisted dying. Now, looking around this room, I can see maybe you are thinking assisted dying, that's for old people. It's not really relevant to me, so why should I care about it? Well, some of you might be in the biomed stream. Anyone in the biomed stream? So this will become a professional issue for you because doctors will be the ones who are expected to perform assisted dying, although there is a conscience clause. So the Victorian government is very, very enthusiastic about their assisted dying legislation. It won't come into effect until 2019, so there's a lot of details to be sorted out. But we do know quite a bit about how the legislation will work. And now that it's been passed in Victoria, it's quite likely that it will be passed in other states. So there's an inquiry in South Australia at the moment. There is a federal a bill being introduced by Senator Leinholm in the Senate, which would allow assisted dying to be legalised in the Northern Territory and the ACT. So it's happening all over the place, or the debate is happening all over the place. So when we think about whether we might agree with this legislation or not, it's important to be clear exactly what question we're addressing. First, what is voluntary assisted dying? It sounds fairly innocuous. I mean, surely everybody would like to be helped or assisted when they're dying. But in fact, it's something of a euphemism. It actually means either a doctor on request providing a prescription for a lethal drug, which the patient then gets from the chemist and keeps at home until they decide that they want to take that lethal drug in order to end their life. And that's always in the past been called physician-assisted suicide or doctor-assisted suicide. But if the patient is physically unable to take the drug because they can't swallow or they're paralysed and they can't actually lift a glass of water to their lips, or also, it hasn't been emphasised, but also it's possible that there is no drug available that can be authorised in Victoria to be used, then the legislation provides for the doctor to administer the lethal drug, most likely by intravenous injection. And that's always been called voluntary euthanasia. So these two things, doctor-assisted suicide, voluntary euthanasia, have been lumped together under the category assisted dying. Now, we should also be clear that the question we're addressing is not whether in extreme circumstances one might ever be justified in ending a patient's life in order to end their suffering. And there are sometimes extreme situations. Usually, though, these kind of extreme situations where you think it might be justified to end someone's life occur in situations like on the battlefield, where there is no medical help available. The patient has suffered terrible injuries. You don't have anything with which to help them. Those sort of situations hardly ever occur in a well-equipped modern hospital. But even if they sometimes do, even if sometimes people have refractory pain, that is pain that is very difficult to manage, that's not actually the question we're being asked to answer. Not whether in some extreme circumstances we might be justified in ending a patient's life from a moral point of view. Rather, the question we're being asked is whether it's a wise social policy to legalise assisted dying under a fairly broad range of circumstances. In other words, one doesn't need to adopt an absolutist stance against all killing in order to oppose the legalisation of assisted dying. Many people who support assisted dying, and the surveys show that many people do so because they think it will only apply for patients with extreme uncontrolled pain or other physical symptoms. Symptoms such as nausea, which is particularly nasty, or shortness of breath. But the Victorian legislation does not actually require that a patient has pain or indeed any physical symptoms at all. Rather, they must be suffering from a medical condition which is advanced, progressive and will cause death, and their suffering cannot be relieved in a manner that they deem tolerable. But of course it's possible to suffer in ways that aren't physical. Their suffering may be related to a loss of autonomy, a feeling of being out of control of what's happening to them, a loss of dignity. And so when we look at the reasons that patients access assisted dying in overseas jurisdictions where it's legal, and there's a number of them, so euthanasia is legal in Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg. Is it Luxembourg or Liechtenstein? I always get confused between those two. And also in several states of the US, about 6 states in the US, assisted suicide is legal. But for instance, in Oregon, where assisted suicide has been legal for about 18 years, so there's very good documentation of what's going on, less than a third of the patients who requested it had or were in fear of inadequate pain control. Less than a third. Instead, what motivated them was psychological factors: depression, hopelessness, feeling tired of life, loss of control, and loss of dignity. Similarly, in the Netherlands, few patients receiving euthanasia had physical pain, but a majority were depressed. Yet in Oregon and the Netherlands, very few patients are ever referred to a psychiatrist. So there was an article in the MJA, the Medical Journal of Australia, last year from Ezekiel Emanuel, who's an American psychiatrist. He said, well, since psychological reasons dominate, psychological reasons for asking for assisted dying, one would think that requiring psychiatric evaluation would be a reasonable safeguard. But the Victorian legislation does not include that reasonable safeguard. Even when a doctor suspects depression, unless the patient's decision-making capacity is in doubt, there's no requirement to refer to a psychiatrist. And you have to be extremely mentally ill before your decision-making capacity is in doubt. Indeed, the legislation is quite specific that the presence of mental illness in itself does not disqualify a person from accessing assisted dying. Now, when we consider the way that the issue was debated in Victoria, there are important lessons to be learned for Christian communities and for those who wish to enter the public debate on the issue. There's a little side about Christian ethics. Christian ethics is often understood as primarily deontological or duty-based. That is, it focuses on obedience to God's commands. This is a Christian version of deontological ethics. Focuses on obedience to God's commands as expressed in the Scripture primarily. And in the Scripture we find both rules, that is, quite specific instructions for how to live, what to do, what not to do, And also we can derive more general principles. A major alternative to this deontological approach is consequentialism, which I'm sure you've all heard of. Yes. A theory that the rightness or wrongness of an action is determined solely by its consequences. The end justifies the means. Now, although, of course, consideration of the consequences of your action is an element of prudence or biblical wisdom, and we ought to think about what we're doing and what will the consequences be, Christian ethics has never been generally understood as consequentialist. In other words, Christian ethics has never been understood as based solely on the consequences. There are other things to consider. So some actions are understood as right or wrong in themselves, regardless of the consequence, bad consequences or good consequences. They're regarded as right or wrong in themselves by virtue of the very nature of the thing that is done. Now, in almost all past moral debates that I can think of in society, Christians would almost always argue on the basis of principles, moral norms. And their opponents would often argue on the basis of consequences. For example, some Christians have argued that potential great benefits cannot justify the deliberate destruction of human life in embryonic stem cell research. Clearly, there are fantastic consequences possible with embryonic stem cell research. Many Christians said, whatever, no matter what good consequences, if you're actually destroying a human embryo, that is a wrong thing to do, so you shouldn't do it. Another example would be people who argue it is wrong to place refugees in indefinite detention in order to protect our borders and save lives at sea. Good consequences, but what you're actually doing is wrong. They say the end does not justify the means. But it's notable that in the recent public debate on assisted dying, Christians arguing against it relied heavily on consequentialist arguments. They said, if we do this, bad things will happen. There will be the risk to the lives of the vulnerable. There will be negative perceptions of disability. There will be a negative effect on suicide prevention programs because suicide will, in a sense, be legitimated by the state and by the medical profession, which is a very powerful profession. One of the main arguments was the dreaded so-called slippery slope, that although the criteria for eligibility for assisted dying might initially be only competent adults with a terminal illness, that inevitably these criteria will get expanded. And already people are arguing this way, and this is what's happened in overseas jurisdictions. Why should psychological suffering alone be excluded, they would argue? People who have a mental illness or are suffering psychologically can suffer terribly. So the argument would be, why shouldn't they be able to access assisted suicide? Why should they have to have a physical illness? And then you might say, why should the patient have to be at the end of their life? Because the Victorian legislation provides that the patient must have no more than 6 months to live, or 12 months if they have a chronic debilitating neurological condition. So the argument would go, why restrict it to those people who are at the end of their life? Why not say, what about people who have a chronic condition that is going to last for years and years, and they're going to be in pain or suffering in some way for many years? Surely it's cruel to exclude those people. And then there's the argument, why do they have to be a competent adult? Surely children can suffer as much as adults. And in the Netherlands and in Belgium, children are euthanised. But what about people with dementia? The Victorian legislation doesn't include them at the moment. It says you have to be competent, you have to be able to know and understand what you're doing to request assisted dying. But many people, and there's probably many of you as well, who perhaps know somebody who has dementia, you think it's a terribly cruel thing. You think, I would never want to be in that situation. And so people say people ought to be able to access assisted dying when they're demented, or at least they ought to be able to say in advance, if I ever get into that situation, I would like to have my life ended. And so the argument goes. And in the Netherlands, what began as a measure for exceptional cases, that was how it was framed, has become so normalised that now 1 in 25 deaths in the Netherlands is a case of assisted dying. 1 in 25, 4%. So, let's think about the arguments on the basis of principles that are relevant in the debate about assisted dying. These arguments were largely missing from the recent debate in Victoria. The arguments on the basis of principles. On the other hand, the people who are arguing for assisted dying did argue on the basis of principles. So we've got those 4 principles there. The ones at the top are the ones which people could use to argue against assisted dying. The other 2 are arguments that were used very powerfully to support assisted dying. So why did the Christians involved in the debate rely so heavily on consequentialist arguments rather than on principles? Well, to a certain extent I think it's understandable in terms of a loss of confidence in specifically Christian arguments in the public square, based on a perception, if not reality, of hostility by an aggressively secular, increasingly secular state. And much of this related to loss of respect for the church as a moral authority because of child sexual abuse. To put it frankly, the church doesn't have much moral capital at the moment. So, Christians involved in this debate tried to frame their arguments in very general terms that would be accessible to anyone. But proponents of assisted dying have, I think, fairly successfully promoted the view that opposition can only be based on religious arguments. So you'll hear that over and over again. Well, of course, so-and-so would oppose assisted dying. He's a Catholic. Or of course, so-and-so wouldn't be in favour. She's a Christian. And if you just leave religion out of it, then assisted dying would be, everyone would support it, surely. That's how the argument goes. So Andrew Denton, who you might recall was very, very active in the debate in Victoria, and had been for a number of years, in fact, I think. He was on a bit of a campaign. He had several podcasts, very actively promoting assisted dying. But he blamed Christians for the failure to support it amongst politicians in the past, and he blamed a hidden theocracy at the heart of government and the unrepresentative Christian lobby for blocking assisted dying so far. Now, this is a view that is widely accepted, that only Christians oppose it, but it's actually quite untrue. It ignores the fact that the opposition of the medical profession to assisted dying goes back to the Hippocratic tradition 4 centuries before Christ and continues today. So the AMA wasn't terribly active and vocal in the debate, but the official AMA policy is to oppose assisted dying. The majority of doctors oppose it, as opposed to the majority of the general public who seem to support it. It's not just the AMA. There are no medical associations anywhere in the world, apart from Holland and possibly Belgium, who do support assisted dying. The American Medical Association is still very much opposed to it, despite the fact that 6 or so states now have assisted suicide, which puts doctors in a difficult position. Nevertheless, despite this reality, this view that somehow opposition to assisted dying can only come from a religious motivation has taken hold. And so people entering the debate are reluctant to use what might seem to be specifically Christian principles like the sanctity of human life. And instead, they relied on consequentialist arguments, hoping that they might get more traction in the secular space. And yet, in the end, in Victoria, even this strategy was unsuccessful. Was it because the counter-argument based on the principles of patient choice, respect for autonomy, and compassion for the suffering were more powerful? Of course, these arguments are very powerful. Most ethical debates, there are competing arguments. It's not just a matter of all the arguments point one way. There's always different arguments to consider. And so in this debate, you're weighing up, on the one hand, respect for human life and justice. We'll talk about that in a minute. On the other hand, compassion for the suffering and respect for patient choices. You can have very powerful arguments on both sides. And so people come down on different sides depending on how they weigh those arguments. And so I think in some cases that's what happened. People just weighed respect for patient choices and compassion more heavily. But I think what actually won the day in Parliament was something rather different and illustrates a disturbing feature of contemporary moral discourse in Australia. What won the debate in Parliament was not actually ethical argument at all. Maybe this is true for many parliamentary debates. Rational debate, I think. There was some, but I don't think that's what actually swayed people. What swayed people was emotive appeals based on story after story of personal experiences with the bad deaths of relatives. Now, most of these experiences happened 20 or more years ago. To say palliative care has improved enormously since then. It's very sad that these people had bad experiences. But this was what really swayed people. Emotive appeals are not ethical arguments. Emotive appeals are not a substitute for ethical argument, but they are resorted to when we have no common ground on which to base such an argument and no shared objective basis for ethics. So how do you weigh up those things if you don't actually have some underlying worldview on which to say these principles are more important? So even though there was a huge amount of evidence from overseas of the dangers of this legislation, and that evidence has so far, until Victoria last year, in all other Australian parliaments in the past has proved decisive in rejecting assisted dying. Last year in Victoria, all that evidence, I think, was fairly airily dismissed. And as in a number of other contemporary debates, ideology trumped evidence and reason. Well, let's think about these principles now in some more detail. Sacredness of human life, I suppose most people would think of as having a specifically religious basis because of that word sacred. But you may know the word sacred, the word holy, which is a similar word, just means set apart. It doesn't actually have any specifically religious connotations necessarily. It just means that human life, the sacredness of human life means human life is different to other kinds of life. We cannot kill a person in the way that we might kill a cow. There's something different involved. But this idea of the specialness of human life is not unique to Christians. It's not specifically or exclusively a Christian concern. So we ought to be able to use this argument in the public square. All societies and cultures have laws against murder, based on the moral belief that it's wrong to kill a human being, or at least an innocent human being. The right to life is the most basic of human rights, and it is in fact the foundation for all other rights. The respect for life is not just a religious value, it's a foundational value of all societies in which reasonable people would want to live. And what even the secular philosopher Jürgen Habermas calls the ethics of the human species. There's something kind of basic about thinking we shouldn't kill other people. The sanctity of human life is also a core Christian doctrine, derived from the Genesis 1 account of humankind being created in the image of God. And the picture there in Genesis 1 is of the Garden of Eden as like a temple. Now, you know, in pagan temples, what sits at the centre of the temple? It's the image of the god. The image, usually in stone or gold, some kind of thing, but a tangible statue, the image of the god that represents the god, and that's what people come to the temple to worship. But in the Garden of Eden, who does God place in the garden? He places humans, human being, male and female. God created them in the image of God. So every human being represents God. And therefore, just as if you go and burn the US flag, you are regarded as having attacked the United States because the flag represents the United States. Each human being represents God, and to attack a human being is actually an attack on God. So this is pretty heavy-duty foundation for this concept of the sacredness of human life in the Christian tradition, because only human beings are described as being created in the image of God, not animals, no other form of life. And this particular basis is then explained as being the basis of the prohibition of murder in Genesis 9 and in the Ten Commandments. We also know how much God values human life because Jesus Christ became a human being. The incarnation and the fact that Jesus dies for us shows us how much God values human life. So to go on to the concept of justice, all societies have a concept of justice. They may be a little different. From a biblical perspective, justice has a strong emphasis on advocating for and protecting the vulnerable and the powerless, which includes the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. It's considered unjust to put at further risk those whose lives are already difficult and often devalued. And this is what it is argued legislating assisted dying will do. It will send a strong message that if you are very sick or you're very disabled, your life is not worth living. It's also considered to be unjust because although the legislation provides that the person must not be coerced in any way in order to ask for assisted dying, the doctor is supposed to ascertain if that is the case. I think it will be very difficult, if not impossible, to ascertain that a patient has not been subtly, or even not so subtly, coerced into requesting assisted dying. Gee, your life is pretty difficult, Mum, isn't it? You know, you're not getting out. Must be miserable here. We won't be able to come and visit very often. You know, maybe you'd be better off getting those tablets from the doctor. Elderly, frail and sick patients are especially vulnerable to implied or explicit messages from their relatives that they are a burden and that the patients would be better off dead. It's naive to assume that people always have the best interests of their relatives at heart. Of course, they often do, and it's wonderful when they do. But elder abuse is a reality in our society. Elder abuse is very prevalent. People exploit their older relatives financially. They abuse them physically. Certainly they often would perhaps think that they would be better off dead. But when this concern was raised with this chap, Henry Marsh, a neurosurgeon, a British neurosurgeon, he said, well, even if a few grannies get bullied into it, isn't that the price worth paying for all the people who could die with dignity? That's a good example of consequentialist reasoning. And it illustrates one of the weaknesses of consequentialism, that how we assess consequences often depends on our previous commitments. For Henry Marsh, a few old grannies are not worth very much compared to the people who could access assisted dying. Probably people like Henry Marsh. But opponents of assisted dying would say, no, that is not a price worth paying. They weigh those up differently. Nevertheless, we have to say in Victoria now, the argument, whether from principles or consequences, has been lost, for the moment at least, and we have to learn to live with legalised assisted dying. And elsewhere in Australia too, this may well become a reality soon. So how are Christian communities going to respond? Very briefly, I would say that we might need to call on another approach to ethics. There is another approach. So there's duty-based approaches, principles and rules. There's consequences. And then there's an approach called virtue ethics, an approach called virtue ethics. And I think that might be a more fruitful approach to living with this new reality. Virtue ethics focuses not so much on what you do, but the kind of person that you are. And priority is given to your character rather than right or wrong actions. Christian virtue ethics, there's a whole lot of different varieties of virtue ethics, but Christian virtue ethics recognises that individual character is formed in a community of faith with a shared story which shapes our community. We need to form communities with an alternative narrative to the culture that enthrones individual choice as the ultimate value and that regards all suffering as meaningless and to be avoided at all costs. Communities which embody in practical ways our affirmation that all human lives are valuable. This is where we need to actually demonstrate it. That by including the disabled, the elderly, the sick and the frail, so that no one is forced because of pressure from their families, loneliness, lack of availability of good quality palliative care or mental health services. No one is forced because of those things to reach such a point of desperation and hopelessness that they feel they have no choice but to ask for assisted dying. Okay, I'll leave it there and open it up for questions. You understood every single thing I said. Yep.
Do you think it's a possibility that it will be overturned with the change of government?
That's a possibility, but it was a conscience vote. It was overwhelmingly passed in the lower house. I think that Matthew Guy would be unlikely, even though he's personally opposed, I think it'd be unlikely to make it a party issue. So if people vote again, according to conscience, unless something else changes, unless we have a very strong campaign to point out the dangers, then the vote would probably go the same way. But I'm not a politician, so I'm... Yep.
Towards the end, you talked about an alternative narrative when it comes to suffering. So I guess if the narrative is suffering is demeaning, dehumanising, humiliating, if it makes life not worth living, almost subhuman in some. If that's the narrative that's out there, could you just give us some idea of the shape of the Christian one, or the starting point? Maybe.
Well, I guess the starting point is an understanding that this world is not as it should be. And so all of our lives are going to involve suffering. Suffering is actually a necessary and inevitable part of every human life. So Stanley Hauerwas, who's a very well-known Christian ethicist, said, if you want to avoid all suffering, you'd have to kill all babies at birth. Because everyone is going to suffer in their life, to one extent or another. So I guess, and then a Christian understanding of that is that's because this world is a fallen world. Because of sin, things are not as they should be. But then we have the narrative of redemption, which says, actually, God is able to bring good things even out of suffering. So I heard someone talking the other day, she was actually talking about from the narrative of Genesis. What the narrative of Genesis tells us is that we have a sovereign God who's able to bring order out of chaos. You were there, you know this, you can probably tell us. I thought it was really striking. Order out of chaos, life out of death, good out of evil. So even though suffering is never a good thing in itself, we have a God who is able to transform it, to redeem it, and to bring something good out of it. Which does not mean that if you have a nasty illness, you shouldn't seek pain relief. But it does mean that in your suffering, whether it's physical or existential, spiritual, emotional, God is able to bring something good out of it. Well, that's a narrative which I suppose is only partly accessible to Christians, and yet it's also accessible to non-Christians. So there's quite a lot of literature along the lines of, and this is a book title, Cancer Was the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me. So people who have a terminal illness use that opportunity to kind of reassess their life and their priorities, what's important to them, and they often find that they can connect in a much more meaningful way with their friends and family, for instance. They see it as a kind of a wake-up call to re-examine their life and, again, bring something good out of something bad. So, was it? Yeah.
Do you think that more emotional appeals will be made in like the Parliament, when decision making, that it will be much more we choose the leaders, but they will implicitly have emotional stances on things that they will bring, instead of thinking about this, they're more about a general consensus?
Well, I would hope not, but it seems to be that that's the way it's going. And I said emotivism is actually a way of describing a system of ethics which people fall back on when you don't actually have a rational basis for a discussion. And so it happens in the abortion debate, for instance. It happens in assisted dying debate. So people have very strong feelings one way or the other. And they have a sense that they can't really connect rationally with people who have a different view. And it's like they're kind of butting up against each other. Often it's because they're coming from quite a different basis for their arguments. So you feel like, I'm not getting anywhere trying to argue about this. I'll never convince the other person. So I'll tell a heart-wrenching story, which will kind of as a substitute for a rational argument. And they're powerful, very powerful. Of course, on the other hand, people who oppose assisted dying can also tell powerful stories. about what happens when you legalise it, about the people who suffer as a consequence. And you'll probably see more of those stories in the next little while if the debate sort of comes up again. Yeah.
Is there a reason why they don't have psychiatric evaluations before euthanasia?
Yeah, the stated reason is it would be too expensive. It would be, yeah, who would pay for that?
They have in the Netherlands?
No,
Psychiatric.
not compulsory. And there's nothing to stop the doctor if they suspect that the patient... Well, in the Netherlands it's slightly different now because severe mental illness is actually accepted as a justification for euthanasia. But in Australia, still, I think many people would feel, well, it would be terrible if somebody had a depression which was treatable, but they didn't get treated and so they requested assisted dying. Effectively, people with untreated depression commit suicide quite frequently. This would be a way of doctors helping them to do that, whereas normally, usually, the understanding at the moment is if a patient has severe depression, we do everything we can to help them, to prevent them from committing suicide. But if assisted dying comes in, we'll actually be saying, no, there's one category of people for whom we'll actually say, oh, we'll help you. Yep.
Would you say that there's any time where assisted dying is the right thing to do or an okay thing to do? And also, if you are a practicing doctor and someone wants to be assisted in their death, is that something, like, how should Christian doctors respond to that?
Well, Christian doctors have to make up their own mind about whether they're prepared to be involved, or they might say blanket no, or they might say, I would only be prepared to be involved in very rare cases where I really believe it's justified. But I'm not sure that the government will allow you to have that kind of nuance. I think, in fact, what will happen is various institutions will opt out, so all the Catholic hospitals will opt out. Christian medical practices will probably just opt out. Extreme cases. Well, as I said, I've talked to a lot of palliative care doctors and they are very confident that they can resolve all physical symptoms. So in relation to physical symptoms, if a person has really terrible pain, or let's say terrible nausea, shortness of breath, as a last resort, they can be sedated so that they are actually unconscious and they can spend the last few days of their lives unconscious. So you can manage those symptoms without killing them. Okay, that's extreme, but that can happen. But you see, the problem is that the suffering that most people are talking about when they request assisted dying is not physical. It's what I might call existential. It's the idea that I'm going to die, I can't do anything about it, this is horrible, I don't want to have to do this. And there's nothing medicine can do about that. There's no medical treatment for existential angst. There's a lot of suffering that medicine cannot deal with. Assisted dying says, yeah, we can deal with that.
The places that had assisted suicide have cases of like elder abuse and how that looks like in like the Netherlands and that, where it acted like, were there more cases of elder abuse?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think elder abuse is it's common everywhere, in every country. It's kind of a human trait, isn't it? Human sin. I mean, to tell you a horrible story, you might have read about this in the paper. It was documented in the Netherlands, and in fact it's going to be investigated. There was a woman who had completed an advance directive saying that when she became demented, if she became demented, she would want to be euthanised. She became demented. and was in a nursing home. But in fact, she changed her mind, and she expressed quite clearly that she did not want to be euthanised. But her family said, no, she's completed the advance directive when she was competent. She's not competent now. We want her to be euthanised. And she was, and the relatives had to hold her down while the doctor gave the injection. And this was actually is in the process of being investigated in the Netherlands, because I think people realised that's not a good situation. And I'm not saying that those relatives were motivated by any malice or that it was a case of elder abuse. They might have honestly felt that, that's what she said she wanted when she was competent, so she ought to have it. But it just seemed a little bit icky. Yeah.
You mentioned that legalisation of assisted dying sends the message that certain lives are worth less than others. Could it not be said that assisted dying doesn't devalue those lives, but rather it simply recognises that life does end, and in the relevant cases within the next 6 to 12 months, and it simply goes to the manner in which the end of that life comes about, rather than saying it's not worth?
Well, it is saying it's not worth living, because if I'm going to die within 6 months, and of course this is one of the other big problems with the legislation, doctors are not that good at predicting. Originally the legislation was for 12 months. I would say doctors are probably not much better than sticking a pin in something to say a patient's going to be dead in 12 months. It doesn't really work like that. So with pressure it was changed to 6 months, which I think is a good thing. But even then, 6 months is quite a long time. You can do a lot in 6 months. And as I said with that person who wrote the book, Cancer Was the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me, the actual process of coming to terms with your mortality can be a very fruitful time for a person, even not just Christians. And there's a whole discipline now of caring for terminally ill people with things called meaning therapy, hope therapy, where people work with patients and they encourage them to look back on their life and to journal or to make recordings, and to just look on their life and see the meaning in it and what they've achieved, and to come to terms with their mortality. So that's a process that is totally cut short and short-circuited if you just decide, no, I'm going to have the injection. And of course, not everybody wants to go through that process. That's why people have a choice. But opposition to assisted dying is not a denial that we are mortal and that there comes a time for everyone to die. So the way I frame it is, death is an enemy. The Bible describes death as an enemy. It's an enemy that ultimately we can't defeat. We can't defeat, but we shouldn't collaborate with it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think there'd be any problem, if people are going through it, do you think they'd have trouble finding the drugs that are available doctor, or do you think it'd be quite easy to access them?
Oh, well, this is unclear. At the moment, there is no drug that is authorised in Victoria which could be used. So Nembutal is the drug that's often used illegally and imported, but it's illegal in Victoria. So they've got to come up with a drug which the pharmaceutical authorities will authorise to be used in this way. It's got to be a drug that is reasonably, I'll say, safe. Not safe because it's going to kill the patient, but it's got to be something that you'll be certain will actually kill the patient, if that's what you want to do, because you don't want the patient to be unconscious for several days or starts vomiting or something really unpleasant. It's got to be fairly quick acting and fairly certain. So far there is no drug available that will do that can be taken orally. The only certain way to kill a patient is to give them an injection. It's the same injection, same process as they use for lethal injection, capital punishment in the US. That's what would be used.
One more question?
So if we are having this discussion outside, what do you think is the best way to approach it in a manner that doesn't leave you susceptible to being called, you're only saying that because you're Christian?
Well, I think, as I said, the best way to approach it is to say, have a look at the way it's worked out in the Netherlands, where it's been legal for more than 20 years. Have a look at the way it's working out in Oregon, where it's been legal for 17 years. Do you think that children should be euthanised? Do you think that people with severe depression should be euthanised? Do you think that people who are just tired of life should be euthanised? I think that's still the most powerful argument, if you're going to have an argument, that the risks are very great. Yeah.
Let's give Dr. Clark Thank you very much for coming and giving us this amazing talk and answering our questions. Is there any resources or books or something like that you'd like people, if they want to find out more, they'd like to go to?
I don't know that I can recommend anything in particular. I mean, there's so much information out there on the internet. There is a group that's just been formed called Australian Care Alliance, which is going to set up a website with material. I'm not sure how much has been put on it yet. There's also an organisation called Hope, which has a website. There's Victorians Against Assisted Suicide. There's so much stuff out there. Yeah.
Sounds good. So next week we're having a forum. It's going to be the same place, same time. It's going to be on Jenny and George are speaking about if happiness or something like that is a good way for Christians to think about living their life. So kind of ties into this consequentialism, deontological kind of divide we've got. So that would be very interesting. Also, you can find out more events and what's happening in the future on our Facebook page, MUQ Forums, plus there's a CU-wide Facebook page for all CU events. So yeah, thanks for coming. Also, we have a gift for you that Sarah has. So that's the end of Forums. Thank you for coming. I hope to see you next week or in the future. And one last round of applause.